Still we are in the primitive stage of medical concept learning or disease learning. So we have to go through this particular nervous system introduction, which I think like 10th grade, 11th grade content, which I am going to show you. So which you are familiar of already. So briefly it is going to take 30 minutes to 45 minutes to understand these particular areas. And I will emphasize on whichever the concept which you have to really understand and really prepare for the anatomic classes later on. Bless you. Now, these are the, okay. So, not audible, I know. Even I can hear you. You have fever? How come? How come so many people have fever? Alright, go ahead. Am I? And mic. Alright, this is good enough. Okay, now. So we have to understand this neuroscience or neuro introductions in these brief headings. So whenever you are talking about these particular neurology introductions, we talk about the nervous system. So this nervous system we are going to talk over here is composed of two basic elements. We call them a central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. And within this central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, the working people who are present over here are fed by these neurons. And neurons are also in adjuvant with these functional is contributed by some support cells. We call them as neuroglial cells. So these particular neurons and neuroglial cells contribute or forms this system and runs this particular human subject. We call them as nervous system. Now this nervous system has got two broad concepts or two broad elements. We call them as central nervous system and also known as peripheral nervous system. They are complementary each other. That means one system cannot work alone, otherwise it is helped from the other element. So we have two elements we agreed to have. We have CNS. And we have to know what exactly CN is composed of, and then we have these PNS, which is the peripheral nervous system. So these two systems, we have to know what this particular element is composed of. So let's begin with this particular nervous system, the divisions which is we are talking about. Now this particular picture is seeing that the brain and along with the spinal cord is taken out with this particular projections from the tentacles like structures coming up from this particular spinal cord. We call them as nerves, spinal nerves. And also we have some nerves which is ejecting out from the brain itself. Over here we call them as these cranial nerves. So this particular brain, which is the circular element, with this particular element continued down as a cylindrical structure down, we call the spinal cord. So this brain and the spinal cord is composing over here is the central nervous system. So brain plus spinal cord is the central nervous system. From this particular brain and the spinal cord, we have these projections coming as these tentacles, we call them as nerves. So this particular nerve which is largely related to the brain, we call them as cranial nerves. And which are coming from the spinal cord from the entire length, we call them as spinal nerves. So these spinal nerves and these cranial nerves together form this particular peripheral nervous system. So again, to come with this particular element, we are taking this particular central nervous system, which is composed of these particular tissues, which is known as the brain component and as well as spinal cord. That's it. It is kind of like a prime element which is holding this central nervous system. Now taking from this particular central nervous system, we are moving to this peripheral nervous system. It is made up of the nerves, which is coming from the brain itself. We call them as cranial nerves. And as well as nerves which are coming from this particular spinal cord, we call them as the spinal nerves. Now we have this particular cranial nerves which is 12 pair in number. We number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 12, and we have this particular 31 pairs of these spinal nerves which is coming from the right side, left side of pairs like this and coming together forming this particular peripheral nerves. So this particular element, peripheral nervous system, is these 12 pairs of the cranial nerve and 11 pairs of the spinal nerves. Now, this particular peripheral nervous system can be divided or can be subdivided into two elements. We call them as somatic system and as well as autonomic system. So, we have this particular peripheral nervous system which is composed of this particular element. We call them as autonomic system and as well as somatic system. So, this element we have to know a little bit about. So, this peripheral nervous system, we call them as somatic system. Now, the word soma means body. So, whatever the body parts we have, which is contributory to this element, somatic nerves, and also known as, along with that, autonomic. That means it is kind of automatic, otherwise you can say, which is also counter-regulatory. So, we have two elements of this particular or subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system existing. We call them as somatic nervous system and as well as autonomic nervous system. Now, this particular somatic nervous system can be divided or subdivided again into two subdivisions. As far as function is concerned, we call them as sensory, other one is motor. Likewise, the autonomic nervous system can also be subdivided into self-regulatory elements. We call them as sympathetic and parasympathetic. So, these two, sympathetic and parasympathetic, are counterbalancing element of each other. One time raises, other one depresses. If the other element raises, other component dips down. So, it's a kind of counterbalancing actions is there. But which is not true in case of this somatic system, which we split into two parts as sensory and motor. Now, this sensory and the motor comes very frequently to us whenever we are going to talk about the anatomical part. Now, the sensory part, that means it is picking up some sensation or picking up some informations. Sensation means touch, pain, temperature, any external stimuli which is coming from the environment. So, that element, picking element, we call them as sensory nerve. So, for example, you are listening, you are picking informations from the environment. That means you are taking some sensations. That sensation coming through your ears, coming through your eyes, that thing element is going to your brain and processing there and saying that this is this. Second thing, we call them as motor. That motor element relates to that which is mobile or leads to the mobility part. That means if you have to move anything, if I have to draw something, if I have to write something, if I have to walk through, I need some muscle to work. Those muscles are activated or innervated or stimulated by the nerves which are known as motor nerves. So, these two nerves frequently or very frequently come across whenever you are learning anatomy, physiology, etc., etc. So, this sensory component and the motor component are two basic elements of the somatic nerves. This we have to understand very well and reproduce well whenever you are coming to this particular anatomy classes, practical or theory part, etc., etc. So, this particular sensory part is receiving sensation, touch, pain, temperature, informations, lights, etc., etc., listening something, special senses, everything which is coming from here. So, sensory nerves are separate nerves, motor nerves are nerves which is related to the muscles. That means some motor actions is there or muscle moving nerves. A mixture of these two may be present. That means a nerve is capable of doing both of these. That means picking up sensation as well as bringing some information back to this particular motor nerves. We call them as mixed kind of nerves. So, if you have a conjunction of these two or any nerve which is capable of doing motor action at the same time picking up sensation, we call them as mixed kind of nerves. So, these three entities are very commonly coming to our anatomy classes whenever we are going to talk. Other thing, autonomic nerves, sympathetic and parasympathetic. This large detail of these particular nerves will be covered in physiology. We will be talking about these particular nerves. We will be seeing this particular sympathetic nerve, parasympathetic nerves as well. But largely, these contributions are physiological. How they are controlling the heart rate, how they are controlling the breaths, etc., etc. That will be more frequently coming in physiology classes. Now, let's talk about whatever I am emphasizing here. The autonomic nerves out here is that the nerves which are controlling the viscera or organs, heart, lungs, intestines, etc., etc. So our heart beats to a particular heart rate, between a range it beats. Our lungs is taking breathing in, breathing out at a particular rate. When you are sitting, when you are running, so there is an autonomic control of these nerves and heart rates over here, which are controlled by these particular autonomic nerves. And autonomic nerves have got two divisions, sensory divisions and sympathetic divisions and parasympathetic divisions. One is increasing, other is decreasing. So we'll be coming into it. So these particular elements, which is unconscious control of this particular visceral or organ, heart, stomach, intestine, glands, are contributed by these nerves, which are known as autonomic nerves. And these autonomic nerves have got two components, sympathetic divisions and parasympathetic divisions. Sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are counter-regulatory. If something is stimulating or discharging, the other element is inhibiting and other system is receiving that until it reaches to a point, then the sympathetic turns up and parasympathetic drops down. So we have a counter-regulatory balance which is controlled over these autonomic nerves. We'll be talking little detail about the sympathetic and parasympathetic in a little bit later on. So let's move to this particular peripheral nerves. So this particular peripheral nerve, other division we mentioned here is a somatic division. So this somatic division we are referring here has got two functional components. One is known as sensory, other is motor. So we have to understand this thing very well. What is sensory and what is motor? Sensory means touch, pen, temperature. So that particular thing is sensory division, and other is known as motor division, which is the muscle actions. So largely whenever going to do the dissection, we are going to see these sensory nerves, we are going to see these motor nerves. So you should be able to understand the difference between sensory nerve and motor nerve, and difference between this particular somatic nerve with autonomic nerves. So this basic understanding will be coming again and again whenever we are talking about. So this is what we have talked so far. We have the nervous system, which is split into central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is composing of the brain and the spinal cord, only this particular neural tissues. The peripheral nervous system is composed of the nerves. The nerves which are coming from the brain, we call them as cranial nerves. The nerve coming from the spinal cord, we call them as spinal nerves. So these particular peripheral nerves, which is composing of 31 pairs of the spinal nerves and 12 pairs of the cranial nerves, together forms a neural system. We call them as autonomic nervous system and somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system can be divided or can be subdivided into two systems, parasympathetic and sympathetic. The somatic system can be functionally, two divisions can be done. One is motor system, other is sensory system. So this much of understanding is necessary. Are we good with this or not? To understand this part. Good. So let's move to these other parts. So this is the broader classification, whatever we are seeing, of these particular neural tissues. Now, as I am saying, this particular system, neural tissues or neural elements is forming this system. So who is basically making this particular system to make a structural element? So we have two elements in the neural tissues in our body which are making this particular nervous system. Number one is the neurons, and number two is supporter of the neurons, that means the glial cells. We call them as neuroglial cells. So to work something with these neurons, we need some assistant or supporting element. So we need a king, and we also need supporters of the king to run a system, to run a democracy or run anything. So we need a king over here, which is a neuron out here, and to help this particular neuron to work, we need a group of people who are helping this. So who are helping here is the neuroglial cells. They are known as, we call them as support cells. Now what support do they provide? They provide the structural integrity of this. They provide the defense action. If something happening, for example, our brain have some infections or something. To deal with that infections, we need some kind of defense cells. That means combat cells, leukocytes or something which is doing in the blood cells. We need some kind of blood element cells which are present in the central nervous system working as a defense cells. We had some kind of packing material. We need something to bridge up this particular gap. So for example, we have a brain tissue damage. Now if I say some of a disease that will be very easy to understand, we have a cerebrovascular accident or a brain stroke. We are familiar with the word brain stroke, right? So where we have a paralysis or something like that. So in case of the brain stroke, what happens? Some brain cell dies out of some injuries. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. So if some brain cell dies, the neurons cannot regenerate. Now, if the neurons cannot regenerate, we need something to replace those damaged cells. So, who is going to replace this? As the neurons cannot produce or cannot replicate after age or after some times, we need something else which is taking up that empty space where the neurons have left. So, these neuroglial cells will produce, will grow and take up the spaces. So, we call them as glial transformation or glial absorbing that particular neural cells. So, that particular neural cells where it is destroyed will be taken up, will be covered by some kind of support cells. What are the support cells? Neuroglial cells, right? So, these are the two basic difference between what is neuron and what is glial cells. So, what is neuron? That's the king. And what are the glial cells? The supporters of it, right? It may be supporting from any damn ways, it is supporting it. But it is not doing the neurons work, but it is supporting it. Now, based on these particular neurons, we can classify, and based on these particular neuroglials, how they are placed, we can also classify the glial cells. Now, these glial cells and the neuron cells and divisions and subdivisions, again, this will fall under physiology. They will teach you in a great detail about the neuronal classifications or neuron, how they are classified, and the glial cells, how they are classified. I am just like breezing through to understand, give an idea about this. I am not digging deep in here. So, for example, how the neuron looks like and how this particular neuron functions, we can classify these particular neurons. So, one classification of the functional unit of neurons you already have mentioned. Like functional neuronal classification is that it could be sensory, it could be motor, and or else it could be something in between or both of them. That means mixed type. It could be sensory neurons, that means they are taking up sensations, they are dedicated. The neurons which are motor, that means moves the muscle, we call them as motor neurons. Now, if they are doing the both, taking up sensation and moving the muscle, we call them as mixed kind of neurons. So, that is the sensory divisions of how the neurons can be classified off. Otherwise, we can call them as morphological divisions or classification. How these particular neurons do look like, we can classify based on this. If the neurons have a particular shape, if the neurons have got projections, if the neurons is placed in some regions, we can classify them. So, this is about not memorizing the things. You understand these divisions exist and you can forget about it. We are not just like bothered much about knowing or detail about this classification and every detail of it. Just know that there are different types of classification. That's why I am just like running through this thing. Say, for example, we have these neurons which has got processes which we are familiar of. Neurons have got cell bodies and have projections. We call them as process. One of them are small, one of them are large. Axons and dendrons. These are the familiar words to us. So, based on these axons number, dendrons number, we can classify them. Number of process, if it is single, we call them as unipolar. If it is more than one, we call them as multipolar. If it is two, we call them as bipolar. If they have pattern like this, we call them as pseudo unipolar. If this particular length of this particular processes are small, we call them as type 1 Golgi. It is long, we call them as Golgi type 2. So, these are the classification that will come across whenever you are studying the morphological divisions of the neuron and as well as the functional divisions of these particular neurons, how they are placed, what the work or what the job they are doing. Now, quickly coming from these particular neurons, the support cells, we call them as neuroglial cells. If the neuroglial cells may be present in the brain cells, may be present outside this particular brain cells or in the peripheral nervous system. That means if they are existing in this particular region, which we call them as central nervous system, we have different types of central nervous system. Glial cells is there. We call them as astrocytes, which are most numerous kind of cells. Oligodendrocytes, they are myelinating cells, which is myelinating or wrapping this particular fatty material around the neurons in the central nervous system. Microglial cells, these are defense cells coming from the monocyte cells. Ependymal cells, they are lining some parts of the brain, making this particular brain non-porous in some of the elements. If this particular glial cell is present within this particular peripheral nervous system, that means within this cranial nerve, within this peripheral nerve, they have a different functions. Two of these are important to us. We have these nerves which is known as Schwann cells. These are the cells which you have to remember. Physiology guys will pull you out with this Schwann cell, their functions, how they wrap and how they functions. We'll be coming briefly about the Schwann cells and functions. So, this is about neurons and glial cells. These are the subdivisions that we have to understand. Now let's move to these particular components or structures of a neuron, so which we are familiar with. It has a cell body, central part, and it has a projections. We call them as process. So there are some processes which are tiny coming from this particular cell body, soma. We call them as dendrons, and then dendrons also have tentacles or smaller divisions. Then it has a downward projections which comes from this particular neurohilla and going down. This is a long process. We call them as axons. These axons have got wrapped around by this fatty material. We call them as myelin sheaths. The myelin sheaths are interrupted. It's not a continuous thing. It is interrupted by some kind of gaps. We call this particular gaps as nodes of Ranvier. Now, these particular myelinations helps us for a better or faster neuronal conductions. So, if this particular information coming from this area, which will be faster contributed or running through if it is myelinated, so that this cross dissemination of these electrical impulses will be less running through if it is myelinated. If it is not myelinated, the informations will be moving slow, that we are familiar with. So this particular element, which is known as axonal terminals, which is splitting into smaller element. So these particular axonal elements may be uniting with something else, maybe uniting with the muscle cells, maybe uniting or making some kind of synapse or shake hand with other neurons. So based on this particular shake hand, if it is making, so if it is a neuron bodies is there, we call them as synaptic connections. So how these particular synaptic connections are making, we can, based on that, we can also classify these neurons. So for example, we have this particular synapse which is contributed or contributing. So if it is contributing between these connections, between these particular actions with this particular dendrite, we call them as axodendric synapse. If it is communicating with this particular actions with this particular soma, we call them as axosomatic. Between this particular actions and the dendron, axon, we call them as axonic kind of synapse. So how these particular neurons are making communication, there's another way we can classify these neurons. But anyways, is largely dealing with not about memorizing thing. We have to understand these are the kind of connections that happens. We call them as synapse. Though these synapses can be of different varieties. If it is maybe uniting with the dendrons, maybe cell bodies, or maybe with another actions. Based on that, we just like give the names to it. So coming from there, moving back to this particular classification part. So this classification part of the neurons, as I am saying, if it having this kind of poles, which is maybe this particular neurons have got like processes coming from one part, we call them as one unipolar. If it is process extending from these two ends of the cell body, we call them as bipolar. If this particular process is extending from these different parts of these particular neurons, we call them as multipolar. So based on this, how these particular neurons look like, based on these projections, how they are coming from the cell bodies, we can classify these particular neurons based on this. Now these are the schematic picture. If you just like a look in the real picture like this, how these particular things look like, we have a neurons projected like this. This is a neurons. You can see that this is the projections of the cell body which you're seeing here, and from the cell body, these are the tentacles like thing which are dendrons going down, and these are the actions which is the longer projections going down, making the synaptic connections, etc., etc. So this is in short about the structures of these particular neurons, and we are very well familiar with this particular thing. We call them as myelin, what the use of myelin, and who makes this particular myelin wrap, which is a Schwann cell in the peripheral nervous system or peripheral nervous cells, which is important to us. Now coming from this particular classification and how do these particular neurons look like in a schematic presentation or in a live pictures, we have a histological sections as well of different types of neuron. How do they look like based on this? So we'll be seeing that when you are learning histology classes on the neurology or the brain or neuroanatomy or neurohistology of the different structures. We'll be seeing them in detail. I'm skipping this part to accelerate this part. So this is what we call about other classification based on the functional part. This is important for us. Sensory part and the motor part. Again, I'm repeating again and again about this particular functional divisions of these neurons. So you should be able to understand the difference between the sensory and the motor. So sensory means touch, pain and temperature. So some of the neurons are dedicated type of neurons who are responsible for picking up sensation. We call them the sensory neurons. Some of the neurons are dedicated completely for the motor movement or muscular movement. So if I am extending or moving any kind of muscles, some of the neurons perhaps working day and night out so that the muscle is moving flawlessly. So these kind of neurons, we call them as motor kind of neurons. They are motor neurons. So once a motor neuron is there, they cannot do the other functions. So if you have motor neuron, they cannot function as a sensory neuron. If you have a sensory neuron, they cannot function as a motor neuron because they are dedicated, they are channeled. Now, other than this, we have a mixed variety. So some of the neurons are ambidextrous. That means they can work with both hands. That means they can do the sensory function, they can do the motor actions. So we call these kind of neurons, which are motor and sensory capability having together, we call them as mixed kind of neurons. So once mixed, they can do the sensory, they can do the motor. But the other way around, they cannot do. So these particular divisions will be coming again and again about the sensory neurons and the motor neurons. So whenever you are going to talk about some of the neurons that you're going to see in the dissection class, we'll be asking about what kind of neurons or what are the functional component of these things. This is sensory or motor. So you have to understand this sensory part. So one sensory, they will be taking sensation. That means if I touch, they will feel that. So they will be giving, their role is that to give the information to the brain that, hey, someone is touching. So brain will decide, all right, what is the thing is happening there. Is the touch is good or not good? It is a kind of hurt or threat or something else. Based on that, brain will recruit some of the nerves which are motor. It will be saying that move away. So I'll be moving away. So my muscles will be working and I'll be moving away. So that the person which is recruiting these particular nerves to move this particular body out, which are done by the motor actions. So the motor nerves will be recruited on that way. So if this particular thing works together, we call them as reflex arc. So what is a reflex arc? So if we have a kind of stimulation that we are seeing here received through receptors through the skin. So there is a pin which is giving a sensation which is painful stimulation going to our skin, penetrating some part which is painful stimulation, and it is been picked up by this particular sensory neurons. Now these sensory neurons taking this information through these particular sensory nerves and going to the spinal cord and to the central nervous system, to the brain, and brain is saying, oh, it's a pin, hurting, move away. It will recruit this particular motor nerves through the same central nervous system, through these particular motor nerves, and recruit the muscles, and muscle will be saying moving out. So together they are performing this action with the stimulation and moving away. We call them as reflex arc. So this thing, sensory and motor, works together in a fashion controlled by the central nervous nerves, which is brain and the spinal cord together to work efficiently for any performing actions. Now, coming off this particular sensation, sensory nerves, as I am saying, this particular sensory nerves are receiving this particular sensation or picking up this particular information. Say if something is touching, touch, pain and temperature, as I am saying, through the nerve ends, we call them as receptors. So if the receptors are on the skin, we call them as cutaneous receptor. There are several types of cutaneous receptors are there. What functions of these receptor as? They have this bunch of chemical substance. They are present within this particular ends, and they will be analyzing this particular information. If it is touch, they will be picking up touch. This is pain, they will be paying. If it is vibration, if it is temperature, if it is something else, they will be picking up. So this particular receptors, we call them as peripheral receptors. They will be receiving, sending this particular to the peripheral nerve and going there. And eventually they are coming back to this particular muscles through this particular muscle end organs. So motor muscles ending on this particular region, we call them as muscle building Golgi tendon organ, will be recruiting to these particular motor actions and doing this end functions. So this particular terminal ends of this particular nerves, sensory nerves or receptors or peripheral nerves or these motor nerve receptors will be there to execute out the final functions. So these particular receptors or classifications of the receptors are there. There are several different nerve kind of receptors are there. Some of them are known as free nerve ending, some of them are known as Purkinje's capsules, etc., etc. In physiology, we'll be learning detail about it. So moving from these particular receptors, which is this particular process, little bit about the myelination that we have to talk about. This is again a physiological domain. So this particular nerve will be wrapped around by some kind of fatty material so that the neural conductions runs in a faster way. So we call them as myelination. This myelination in the peripheral nervous system is done by these particular glial cells. That particular glial cells which is present on there, we call them as Schwann cells. And in case of this particular myelination in the central nervous system is done by another glial cell, we call them as oligodendrocytes. These are the two names that you have to keep in mind regard to the glial cells at this point. So Schwann cells for the peripheral nervous system myelination and the central nervous system by these oligodendrocytes or oligodendroglials. So these are the two things about myelination that you have to keep in mind. So summarize again: central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, autonomic and somatic, parasympathetic and sympathetic, and somatic is having two components, sensory and motor. How they are functioning with the reflex arc mechanism, we already have an understanding on this. Now coming to the other divisions of this peripheral nervous system. So we will talk about the somatic nervous system. This is the other system of the peripheral nervous system. We call them as autonomic nervous system. As you have said, the autonomic nervous system also have two components, sympathetic component and parasympathetic component. They are counter-regulatory. One is controlling or increasing, other is decreasing. So this parasympathetic component and sympathetic component are contributed or formed by these same nerves, the peripheral nerves or peripheral nerves which is present in the spinal cord, which is known as spinal nerve, and as well as this particular the cranial nerves. So cranial nerves and this particular spinal nerves contributes to this particular sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of this part. So this particular parasympathetic functions is if you are going to talk about, they increase the salivary flow, they slow the heartbeat, they constrict the bronchus, they stimulate the peristalsis of the secretion. If you look at this opposite actions from this parasympathetic, they do the reverse thing. So the sympathetic dilates the pupil, they inhibits the heart flow, accelerates the heartbeat, dilates the bronchi, they inhibits the peristalsis, etc., etc. So these are the counter-regulatory system which is present in a body. Where do they work? They work in the organs or viscera which is beyond our control. We consciously do not control over this particular element. So as for example, if I ask you to do this particular increase the heart rate from 60 to 90, we cannot voluntarily do that. It will be coming across whenever doing some actions. Some of the organs, for example the lungs, have got dual innervation. That means they have the autonomic innervation and as well as they have a somatic innervation. So there is a normal breathing control which is going on. Say for example, we are taking like 12 to 14 respiratory cycle in a wide breathing compound. If I want to say that now you can increase this particular breathing rate. So with the voluntary control, we may able to increase the breathing rates we are doing right now. So we can increase it. But with this particular heart rate, we cannot do that because that's only singly controlled or only autonomic control. The respiratory system have got somatic control as well as autonomic control. So these are the things that you have to understand regarding to this parasympathetic system and sympathetic divisions, which are components of this autonomic nerves, and superimposition of somatic system on some of the organs that is present to us. Now talking about these particular nerves or these particular nerves in Vivek, আবার ক্লিক করে দেন, এই পাওয়ার পয়েন্টে ক্লিক করে দেন। ঠিক আছে, talking about this particular anatomy of the spinal nerve, that will cover up this particular discussion today. This is what we have to understand. This is what we have to learn. This is what we have to understand about this particular spinal nerve. And this is the element for this or terminal element or this particular last content of this class for now. So this is, we are seeing here a cross sections of the spinal cord. Now this cross section of the spinal cord you are seeing there, we have a deep content, we call them as gray matter, and surrounding this particular area we have a white content, we call them as white matter. So this particular gray matter is the house for the neuronal cell bodies. That means the neuron cells, that circular element is present on it. So this particular spinal cord projects two kind of spinal nerves or two kind of spinal projections is coming on these areas. we have one nerve fibers coming like this and another nerve fiber coming like this. So we call them as dorsal root of the spinal nerve and the ventral root of the spinal nerve. Now you see that this dorsal root of the spinal nerve and the ventral root of the spinal nerve unite together, makes this particular common spinal nerve. So once this particular common spinal nerve is there, it has a small course, then it splits. This is the back side, we call them as dorsal side. This is the front side, we call them as ventral side. So it splits into two parts. This split over here, we call them as a ramus. So one split is going back side, we call them as dorsal ramus. One split is coming forwardly, we call them as ventral ramus. So this particular dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus and the spinal roots or ventral root and the dorsal root, we should understand and we should have an understanding of this. I would ask you to draw this particular picture of this schematic picture, whatever you are seeing in here. For example, we draw a spinal cord like this and it has a cell body like this and we have projections like this, two coming out. So one of them or of this we call them as roots. So this is root A and root B, that's what we are seeing here. So this root A and root B unites together, makes a root which is known as C. Now this particular C again splits into two parts, making D and E. So each of these A, B, C, D, E you have to know and what do you mean by this, and based on this particular understanding, these particular names A, B, C, D, E, we are going into the thing that in the anatomy we are going to talk. So this is a spinal cord which you are seeing here in a cross section and making this particular A root and B root. So compare with this particular root, it is coming on the dorsal side, back side, we call them as dorsal root. So A is the dorsal root, B is the ventral root. So A root and B root uniting together making a C root. This C root is the spinal nerve. So this particular spinal nerve is really small. After that, this C splits into E and D. E is a longer one which is going through this ventral side or anterior part of the body. So this E we have to know, and D which is moving back to the back side, we call them as dorsal root. Now this particular E, as you are seeing here, it is going to this particular parts of the body or front side of the body, which you are seeing here like this, going out and making several nerves, bunch of nerves is coming out. This is what we are going to see whenever we are going to do the dissections. So during dissections, we will be coming across this particular terms as a rami. So where we are going to see the rami, next class onwards, we will be throwing this particular terms as nerve plexus. So this is what we are beginning with in next subsequent classes with the nerve plexus. A nerve plexus is present in the upper part of the body, we call them as brachial plexus. So this particular brachial plexus is a synapse of the nerves or nerve roots or nerve rami. So we have this particular nerve roots which is splitting into and coming and joining together makes a plexus like this. And this complex network of the plexus is uniting and disintegrating and making small several nerves. We have together 21 nerves will be coming from this particular nerves chain. And each of them have a different name, each of them have a different function, each of them have a different diseases coming on. So 21 nerves from these regions, we may have a 60 or onwards problem based on this. So now next week onwards, we will be landing on this. So this formation of brachial plexus will bring us to this particular old picture of this one. So this spinal nerve is shooting into two nerves, dorsal root and ventral root uniting together making this particular common spinal nerve. Again it's splitting into dorsal rami and ventral rami. So you should be able to understand or comprehend the difference between the roots and the rami. So roots are something and rami is something. Roots is coming directly from the spinal cord, linked with it. Rami is coming from the spinal nerve which is happening or splitting after this nerve is formed. So this small thing appears to be a small thing, something coming, uniting and splitting. But whenever you are learning in a larger scale, it is going to be difficult, or comprehending and understanding the thing whenever you are seeing it will be difficult. So this picture you have to keep in the beginning of all of these things whenever you are going to learn about this particular nerve complex roots which is known as brachial plexus. So this nerve divisions of the spinal nerve is important. What do you mean by this dorsal root? What do you mean by this ventral root? What do you mean by this common spinal nerve? And what do you mean by this ventral rami? And what do you mean by the dorsal rami? And what they are actually contributing on will be reflected on whenever you are dealing with the nerve plexus. On subsequently, as I am mentioning, next week we are going to talk about this complex network of nerves. We are going to dissect this, and again whenever you are dissecting it, no more turning back. We cannot come back to this particular basic classes. So this is your chance to understand this small difference about this particular spinal nerve, which you are going to deal with in the next subsequent class in the dissections. You will be seeing the bunch of the nerves. You are not going to see these particular thick or smaller divisions. So these particular divisions of the spinal nerve and the roots, rami, what do you mean by this? Dorsal rami, what do you mean by the dorsal rami? What do you mean by the ventral rami? What do you mean by the dorsal root? What do you mean by the ventral root? That you have to understand. Now then we have a small term which is ganglion. So there will be another element which you will be seeing here. I am not want to make it a little complex, talking about so many things, but the ganglion is another entity which will be coming on here. So ganglion will be a neural body or neural structure that is related to nerve roots. So the neural structure that is related to the nerve root, if you look at it, it will be a little swollen, it will be dilated. Now why there is a swelling of these nerve root structure which is related to these neural tissues over here. So we have this particular neurons which has got two parts. One is projection part, other is the cell body. So this cell body of these neurons are present in the brain, present in the spinal cord. So other than the brain and the spinal cord, if you have the neuronal cell bodies, which is this one, present, collected somewhere, we call them as ganglions. So ganglions are collections of the neuronal cell body outside the central nervous system. If it is located in the peripheral nervous system, we call them as peripheral ganglion. If it is present in the central nervous system, we call them the central ganglion. So ganglion is nothing but collections of the cell bodies. What do you mean by the cell bodies? That means the cytoplasm of these neural cells, of these glial cells, if it is there. So it is not holding these projections. What do you mean by the projections? Actions. So it is not there. If only we have a cluster of these neuronal somatic cell body is there, collected somewhere outside the central nervous system in a circular way, we call them as ganglions. So we have a picture of ganglion. How do these look like? If you just see it here, so this is a cross section of the spinal cord. You see that this is the dorsal root, this is the ventral root. Now looking at the dorsal root, if you just reach to the point, you see that little bit dilated or little bit swollen element is there. It looks like a node. So this particular node which you are seeing here is a swollen part within this nerve root, we call them as dorsal root ganglion. So this word ganglion means here is a collections of cell bodies which is present within this nerve. So that is not present within the central nervous system. What do you mean by the central nervous system? So if it was present in this part, which is spinal cord, we could have called it something cell body connections over the central nervous system. So as it is located outside the central nervous system, the neuronal cell body present outside to it, we call them as ganglion or collections of the neuronal cell body outside the central nervous system or brain or spinal cord. So having said this, this is a magnified view that you are seeing here. So this is known as the dorsal root, this is the ventral root, and this is the dorsal root ganglion. So this swollen part you are seeing here is a collections of the cell body of the neurons that is present outside the central nervous system. So this is all in short about this particular neural tissue that you have to understand, or introductions of the neural tissue that you need to understand. So you should be able to understand what do you mean the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, the subdivisions of the what this particular central nervous system is composing of, peripheral nervous system what this composed of, what are the subdivisions like autonomic and somatic. Somatic subdivision sensory motor, autonomic which is sympathetic and parasympathetic. How do they functions? How do this particular spinal nerve look like, having two roots, ventral root, dorsal root? What do you mean by the rami? What exactly this particular ramis are doing, and what is the role of this particular rami or the spinal nerves in terms of neural plexus formation? That will be coming on future classes as well, whenever you're going to learn. And little bit about the glial cells. What do you mean by the glial cells? How this particular glial cells matters to us? What are the different types of the glial cells that we will encounter out here? The glial cells will be just like emphasizing on two of you, because MCQs and these particular clinical questions also comes on based on these two nerves, glial cells, which is known as the Schwann cell and oligodendrocyte. Their functions and the diseases out of this particular Schwann cell diseases and oligodendrocyte diseases. So these are the elements about the glial cells that you have to understand. And in just this is the orientations, divisions and the classifications and all these particular subdivisions of these neurons, like unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, or the functional part. We just like do not expect you to memorize each and everything, because that is not necessary. Only thing, the sensory and motor thing and the mixed element is necessary for us. You cannot come to the examination without saying, I do not understand about the sensory nerves, I do not understand about this motor nerves or mixed nerves. That you cannot come in an examination and say, I do not understand those things. So you must understand the sensory divisions and the motor division. Sympathetic and parasympathetic, which is a component of autonomic thing, which will be largely covered in the physiology classes as well. So you will be learning the detail of this particular element, and they will test you in examination as well. So this is all about the nervous tissues for introduction is concerned. And histologically, we will be learning little bit like a structural morphological of different types of neurons in histology classes. So we will leave that for that particular classes.